They say history is written by the victors. But what about the chapters that were never written at all? Across thousands of years, entire centuries have vanished into silence, times when cities fell, scripts stopped, and memory faded. This is Lost Centuries, a journey through the forgotten gaps of ancient history. From collapsed empires to erased voices, we explore the mysteries hidden between the lines of what we think we know. The Lost Century, shadows over Europe's forgotten age. There was a time when the roads of Europe pulsed with movement, where armies marched beneath imperial banners and ideas flowed like river currents between marble cities. Rome, once the axis of civilization, ruled not only with the sword but with systems, law, language, trade, memory itself. But then, like a torch left in the rain, that light flickered and went out. In the year 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell, and with it began a long and unnerving silence across the continent, a silence that would stretch for centuries and would come to be known as the Dark Ages. This was not merely the fall of an empire. It was the unraveling of a world. As Rome's bureaucratic web dissolved, so too did its roads, aqueducts, schools, libraries, and the thin thread that held memory intact. Cities that once buzzed with senators and scholars fell to ruin. Bathhouses grew cold. The written word became rare. History itself began to vanish, and the people who lived through the early centuries after Rome's collapse left behind little more than whispers in stone and fragments in the earth. It is not that they ceased to exist, but that their existence passed mostly unrecorded, and in history, to be unrecorded is almost to have never lived at all. What followed was a strange and haunting vacuum in Europe's memory. From the 5th to the 10th century, an enormous swath of time exists with far fewer written records than the centuries before or after. Historians look back at this void and find entire generations missing, kings we cannot name, wars whose causes we cannot trace, cities that appear and disappear with no explanation. In place of chronicles there are myths. In place of order there is drift. Scholars have long debated the reasons for this collapse into historical darkness. Some point to war and invasion, the waves of Goths, Vandals, Huns, and later Norsemen that battered the continent and turned once stable provinces into contested frontiers. Others speak of disease, such as the plague that swept through Constantinople in the 6th century, and may have reached further than we know. Many note that centralized authority crumbled, replaced by local warlords and feudal power structures, which kept poor records and had little interest in legacy. But even these explanations do not fully account for how the light of civilization dimmed so quickly and remained dim for so long. In some areas, like Gaul and the British Isles, even the names of rulers blur into the realm of legend. What survives are poetic echoes, half-historical saints, and sagas passed down orally. In this fog, fact and fable merge. It is during this period that Arthurian legends first began to surface, not in polished courtly tales, but in raw, uncertain stories of a lost leader whose memory lingered where records did not. Yet there were still those who clung to the flame of knowledge. In monasteries perched on lonely cliffs or buried deep in forests, monks copied what few texts they had: Aristotle, Cicero, scripture, fragments of medicine and astronomy. These scribes became the keepers of the past, transcribing ideas from worlds they could barely imagine, preserving them through long winters of war and uncertainty. But even they could not halt the erosion entirely. Many copied texts blindly, without understanding the languages or concepts. Some embellished, others omitted. With every copy, the original faded a little more. Archaeologists today uncover clues from this era that offer strange and conflicting images. There are graves with Roman coins buried centuries after Rome's fall. Fortresses built with stonework too advanced for the supposed technological level of the time. Shards of pottery and metal tools appear in places they shouldn't, belonging to trade routes that no longer existed. Some ruins suggest civilizations that attempted to rebuild, only to collapse again. The silence was not total, but it was deep, and riddled with contradictions. Even the Church, which gained immense power during this time, presents puzzles. Certain early saints appear suddenly in records with no prior mention, as if inserted retroactively. Whole councils are documented without clear dates or locations. In some cases, historical figures may be composites or inventions meant to establish authority. The temptation to reshape the past, to backdate one's legitimacy or erase rivals, was strong, and the tools to resist it were weak. By the time the light began to return, around the year 1000, Europe had been transformed. The old Roman systems were gone. Latin had splintered into new languages. Pagan beliefs had been mostly absorbed or buried. New kingdoms emerged, claiming descent from empires they never truly knew. And the people, inheriting a broken memory, rebuilt their world on foundations they only partly understood. It is this eerie transformation, this civilizational forgetting, that gives the Dark Ages their haunting character. Not merely because of the wars and losses, but because of the unknowns, the things that were allowed to vanish, the knowledge that was not passed on, and the strange gaps that remain in our collective understanding. There is a question that lingers in the silence. Was this simply a collapse, or was something else at work? Some theorists, controversial but persistent, suggest that history may have been more than lost, it may have been manipulated. That gaps were not just the result of chaos, but choices. That certain knowledge may have been deliberately destroyed. That some timelines may have been stretched or compressed to suit new powers. While such claims remain speculative, the very fact that they arise from the historical fog shows how deep our uncertainty runs. What is most unsettling is not that we know so little, but that we may never be able to know more. For a civilization obsessed with documenting its present and preserving its past, the Dark Ages stand as a mirror we cannot see through. They are the blind spot of the Western world, the chapter torn from the book, the voice muffled behind stone walls. Yet traces remain. A torn manuscript in a monastery. A forgotten inscription on a weathered tomb. A melody in an ancient tongue sung by villagers who never knew its meaning. These fragments call to us, not with answers, but with presence. They remind us that the silence was never total. That in the darkness someone still whispered. Someone remembered. Perhaps the Dark Ages were not as empty as we think. Perhaps they were not dark at all, but merely unseen, misunderstood, or willfully hidden. And perhaps, in that very uncertainty, lies the key to why they still fascinate us. Because when history falls silent, the imagination steps in. And in the gaps, we see not just what was lost, but what might have been taken. Now we turn from what may have been forgotten to what may never have existed at all. Join us as we step into the next great mystery, the phantom time hypothesis, and the claim that centuries of our history were invented. Phantom time hypothesis, the century that never was. Time is the one thing we all believe we understand. It flows forward, second by second, year by year, century by century. We chart it, measure it, archive it. Our calendars and clocks, our histories and anniversaries, all rely on the idea that time is fixed and faithfully recorded. But what if it isn't? What if, buried deep within our historical timeline, there is something false, a section of time that never existed, but was made to appear as though it did? In the 1990s, a German historian named Herbert Illig proposed one of the most startling ideas in the study of history. He believed that the years between 614 and 911 AD, almost 300 years of European history, were fabricated. Not forgotten, not lost, but deliberately inserted into the timeline by a group of powerful individuals in the 10th century. This theory, known as the phantom time hypothesis, suggests that we are not actually living in the 21st century, but closer to the 18th. According to Illig, those missing centuries were never lived. They were written into existence. It's a bold claim, and on the surface, it sounds absurd. But the pieces of the puzzle, once examined, are more unsettling than they first appear. Illig began with a question that has haunted historians for generations. Why is there so little evidence from the so-called early Middle Ages? The centuries following the fall of Rome are notoriously dark. Records are sparse. Architecture stagnates. Political transitions are hazy. Kings appear in written sources without clear lineages or physical evidence. Literacy declines. Trade routes vanish. In some parts of Europe, it's as if time itself slowed to a crawl, or stopped. Illig didn't believe in coincidence. He studied discrepancies between the Julian and Gregorian calendars. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, it was intended to correct a drift caused by miscalculations in the Julian system. Based on the length of the solar year, the drift should have accumulated to around 13 days since the Julian calendar's inception in 45 BC. But it had only drifted by 10. This, Illig claimed, could be explained if about 3 centuries had been inserted, centuries that had never actually occurred. He went further. He examined the reign of Charlemagne, the famed emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a figure who plays a pivotal role in European history. But Illig found problems. The historical record for Charlemagne, he argued, was weak. The documents came from centuries after his supposed reign. The architecture attributed to his empire did not match the technological timeline. Coins, texts, and inscriptions were limited. It was almost as if Charlemagne was more myth than man, a carefully constructed ancestor used to legitimize later rulers. This led to the core of Illig's theory, that Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII colluded to rewrite history. By artificially placing themselves at the symbolic year 1000 AD, they could claim greater spiritual and political authority. It was a manufactured milestone, giving their reign a sense of divine timing. To make that possible, they had to bridge a gap, so they invented the gap. They inserted phantom centuries, complete with fictional rulers, battles, and events. Mainstream historians, of course, reject this theory. They point to archaeological evidence that spans the alleged phantom centuries: coins, art, building ruins, and texts. They argue that the calendar drift is more complex than Illig calculated, and that gaps in documentation can be explained by wars, illiteracy, and the fragility of ancient materials. And yet, even with those counterarguments, the theory continues to unsettle. Because underneath its boldest claims lies a truth few want to confront: the fragility of our timeline. History, as we know it, is not a perfect record. It's a patchwork of surviving documents, transcriptions, interpretations, and political agendas. Much of what we call fact is based on very little, sometimes a single manuscript, a lone coin, a tombstone that may have been moved. The early Middle Ages, in particular, are so poorly documented that scholars often rely on later sources, sometimes centuries removed from the events they describe. The room for distortion, intentional or accidental, is enormous. There are other anomalies, too. Some ancient ruins appear more advanced than the people of their time should have been capable of building. Others seem to have no place in the timeline at all. There are references to solar eclipses, comets, or planetary alignments that don't match what astronomy tells us should have been visible in those years. Some kingdoms rise and fall with almost no archaeological trace, while others leave behind artifacts that seem to jump centuries ahead. Even in our modern understanding of time, there are remnants of uncertainty. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, maintained its own dating system long after the West adopted others. Various regions measured years from different reference points: births of emperors, deaths of saints, founding of cities. Aligning these calendars was never precise. A mistake, once made, could be carried forward for generations. Or worse, someone in power could take advantage of that confusion. The idea that history can be manipulated is not new. Dynasties have rewritten genealogies. Churches have erased heretical sections. Conquerors have burned libraries, altered maps, and renamed cities. If a powerful regime in the 10th century had both motive and means, it would not have taken much to alter the written record. Especially in a world where most people could not read, and where truth flowed from the quills of a very select few. So is the phantom time hypothesis true? We may never know. But that's not the most important question. The power of this theory lies in what it makes us confront: that our past is vulnerable, that centuries we take for granted might not be as solid as we believe, and that time itself, once bent, leaves no easy fingerprints. Whether or not 300 years were fabricated, we are left with the unsettling possibility that some histories may be constructed illusions. We trust the continuity of time because we need to. It holds our identities, our nations, our sense of progress. But history is not immune to human hands. And if someone once reached into the river of time and added stones where there were none, would we even notice the splash? Now we move from phantom time to a real collapse, one not built on theory but written in fire and ruin. A collapse that brought down the greatest powers of the ancient world all at once, and left behind nothing but ash and mystery. Join us in the next journey as we uncover the story of the Bronze Age collapse, when civilizations vanished and the world fell silent. The Bronze Age collapse, when the world fell silent. Before the fall, there was a world where kingdoms thrived across the Mediterranean, where palaces stood tall along the shores of Anatolia and Greece, where merchants crossed seas with copper, tin, glass, and incense, and where letters passed between kings who called each other brother. It was a time of immense connection. From the Mycenaeans in Greece to the Hittites in Anatolia, from Ugarit and Canaan to mighty Egypt, this world was built on trade, diplomacy, and shared knowledge. And then, within the span of just a few decades, it ended. Between the years 1200 and 1150 BC, nearly every major Bronze Age civilization collapsed. Not faded, not weakened, collapsed. The palaces were destroyed. The records stopped. Cities burned. Literacy disappeared. And the world that had taken centuries to build was reduced to scattered ruins and stories passed down in silence. What happened remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history. The Mycenaeans, whose cities inspired the legends of Homer, vanished. Their linear writing system ceased to exist, and Greece entered a dark age that would last hundreds of years. The Hittite Empire, once a rival to Egypt, fell so completely that for centuries people forgot it had ever existed. The great city of Ugarit was abandoned so suddenly that clay tablets were left unfired in kilns, including royal letters pleading for aid that never came. In Mesopotamia, Kassite Babylon declined. The Cypriots saw their culture overturned. The Levant fractured. Even Egypt, which survived, did so only barely, emerging shaken and never quite the same. So many powers fell at once that historians have struggled to explain the scale of the devastation. There is no single cause, no one enemy, no clear starting point. Instead, what we see is a chain reaction, a great unraveling of the ancient world whose threads we are still trying to trace. Some scholars point to environmental change. There is evidence of prolonged droughts during this period, which would have led to crop failure, famine, and instability. Tree rings and sediment layers suggest the climate turned against the people who depended on regular floods and harvests. But drought alone does not burn cities or erase empires. Others highlight earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean lies on active fault lines, and archaeological layers show signs of sudden destruction. Buildings toppled, walls split, homes collapsed. A wave of seismic activity could have weakened many cities at once. But again, earthquakes destroy structures, not societies. War is also part of the story. In Egyptian records, we find a chilling description of a mysterious force known only as the Sea Peoples. They arrived in massive waves, attacking by land and sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them, and the carvings on the walls of Medinet Habu show ships locked in battle and captives driven before the pharaoh. The Sea Peoples were fierce and well organized, but their exact origin remains unknown. Were they displaced migrants? Mercenaries gone rogue? Survivors from other fallen kingdoms? No one knows. Their languages have been lost. Their homelands are a mystery. What is clear is that after the Sea Peoples came, the world was different. Some historians believe that the collapse was driven by a combination of disasters, climate, earthquakes, invasion, famine, and internal rebellion. They call it a systems collapse, where the failure of one element triggers the failure of others, until nothing remains. Others see evidence of something deeper, of a slow unraveling of faith, loyalty, and structure. In some cities, palaces were burned but houses nearby were left untouched. This suggests the destruction came not from without, but from within, an uprising, perhaps, or a final act of vengeance by those who had nothing left to lose. What is most unsettling is not just the loss of buildings or wealth, but the loss of memory. Writing systems that had been in use for centuries disappeared. Trade routes fell silent. Languages vanished. In many places, people no longer knew how to build what their ancestors had made. Knowledge faded. Time itself seemed to fall apart. The collapse created a kind of civilizational amnesia. In its wake, the Iron Age rose, not as a continuation, but as a reset. New peoples emerged. New cultures formed. But the unity, complexity, and connectedness of the late Bronze Age never returned in the same way. We are left with fragments. A half-burned tablet. A shattered wall. A name carved into a seal, with no known kingdom behind it. And in the face of these ruins, the silence is deafening. Some suggest that the Sea Peoples were not just raiders, but the final wave of survivors from already collapsing societies, people pushed by desperation, hunger, or fear into a world that no longer had room for them. Others believe they were used as a cover story, scapegoats for an internal breakdown that no ruler wanted to admit. And a few, on the fringe, whisper that the collapse was not entirely natural. That somewhere in the confusion, something was erased. That knowledge once held by the priesthoods, or the royal houses, or even traveling scholars, was deliberately buried, burned, or forgotten. That the collapse was not only of cities but of truth. Because civilizations do not only fall from without. Sometimes, they are made to fall from within. The Bronze Age collapse stands as a warning. Not just of disaster, but of how fragile complexity can be. How quickly it can turn to dust. And how easy it is for a connected world to become a shattered one. Today, archaeologists are still uncovering the evidence of those final days. Storage jars packed in haste. Weapons left behind. Skeletons in the streets. Letters pleading for help that never arrived. These discoveries do not offer easy answers, but they deepen the mystery. They remind us that the people of that time were real, that they had lives, fears, and dreams, and that those dreams ended, suddenly and without explanation. The more we learn, the more we realize how much has been lost. And the question remains, what truly ended the Bronze Age? Was it drought, war, rebellion, plague? Or was it something more hidden, something that left no inscription, no signature, only silence? Perhaps the answer lies not in what was destroyed, but in what was never rebuilt. From the ashes of collapsing empires across the Mediterranean, we now turn our eyes to the Nile, where even the gods seem to vanish. In the same era that Mycenae and Hattusa fell, Egypt too began to tremble. Temples grew silent, pharaohs disappeared from record, and chaos crept into the sacred order. Join us next as we descend into the first intermediate period of ancient Egypt, a century where history broke and memory faded in the land of eternity. First intermediate period of ancient Egypt, the collapse of the gods. For centuries, Egypt stood like a monument carved into time. Its pharaohs were not just rulers, they were gods on earth. Their tombs pierced the sky, their names etched into eternal stone. The Nile rose and fell in perfect rhythm. Order reigned. Grain flowed. The balance of the world, known as Ma'at, held everything in harmony. And then, as if the divine thread had snapped, the order unraveled. Around the year 2181 BC, the Old Kingdom came to an end. What followed was not a conquest, nor a dramatic war of succession. It was something quieter, more insidious. The central authority dissolved. The Great Pyramids stopped rising. The voice of the pharaoh grew faint. And Egypt slipped into what we now call the First Intermediate Period, a time of broken dynasties, fractured power, and spiritual silence. The collapse of the Old Kingdom is still not fully understood. Some historians suggest that low Nile floods led to famine, weakening the centralized government in Memphis. Others point to internal corruption, rivalries among provincial leaders, and the steady erosion of the king's divine image. But no single cause explains the depth of what was lost. For over a century, Egypt drifted without a clear center. Instead of one king, there were many. Instead of pyramids, there were makeshift tombs. Instead of a unified Egypt, there was chaos. The country split into at least two main regions of power. In the north, rulers emerged in Heracleopolis. In the south, Thebes began to rise. Between them lay contested lands, shifting allegiances, and small-scale conflicts. But what's most unsettling about this period is not just the fragmentation of political power, it's the eerie absence of the divine. For a civilization built on the certainty of eternity, the first intermediate period reads like a wound in the record. Tomb inscriptions became rare. Large-scale building ceased. Priestly activity diminished. Even the gods, who once filled every corner of Egyptian life, seemed to withdraw. The grand rituals that had sustained cosmic balance were no longer performed in the same way, or at all. For the average Egyptian, it must have felt as though the world had lost its anchor. There are fragments from this era that hint at a deeper despair. One of the most haunting is a text known as the Admonitions of Epure, a poetic lament that may reflect the social trauma of the time. In its verses, the author cries out against a world turned upside down, the rich made poor, the poor elevated, famine stalking the land, and law replaced by chaos. Though its dating remains debated, its tone mirrors what archaeologists find in the layers of this lost century: disruption, reversal, collapse. The Old Kingdom had presented a world in which everything had a place, from the lowliest laborer to the radiant sun god Ra. But in the first intermediate period, that cosmic map was torn. Without the unifying presence of the pharaoh, regional leaders, called nomarchs, gained power. Some ruled wisely. Others clashed. Many began commissioning their own tombs, mimicking royal traditions on a smaller scale. In doing so, they chipped away at the idea that only the king could claim a divine afterlife. The very concept of sacred kingship was under threat. And yet, even amid the fragmentation, something stirred. In Thebes, a local family rose to prominence. They did not call themselves gods. They did not build massive pyramids. But they fought, not just with weapons, but with memory. They revived forgotten rituals. They honored ancestors. They called on gods who had grown silent. And slowly, they began to restore order. This family would become the 11th dynasty, and under Mentuhotep II, Thebes would reconquer the north and reunite Egypt. But their triumph did not erase the shadows of what came before. In fact, the memory of the first intermediate period was treated with suspicion, even shame. Later king lists omitted many rulers from this era, as though pretending they had never existed. Their names were left off temple walls. Their monuments, if they had any, were neglected or repurposed. To erase a name in ancient Egypt was to condemn the soul to oblivion. This deliberate forgetting raises uncomfortable questions. Why were these rulers erased? What did they do, or fail to do, that made later generations hide their legacy? Could it be that they saw or encountered something that challenged the core beliefs of Egyptian cosmology? Or was it simply that their existence reminded later kings of a time when gods did not answer and the Nile ran dry? There are tombs from this period with unusual features. Some display iconography not seen before or after. Others suggest changes in burial practices, including body orientation and grave goods that seem out of place. In a few, the artwork contains symbols and figures that are hard to interpret, even for experts. While none of this is proof of any grand secret, it does point to experimentation, uncertainty, and perhaps an attempt to reconcile with forces no longer understood. The first intermediate period was a time when the known world broke. But from its ruins came something new. The Middle Kingdom, which followed, would be more introspective, more disciplined, and in many ways more profound than what came before. Its literature became deeper. Its art more expressive. Its kings more cautious. The memory of collapse had shaped them. And yet, the question remains. Was the first intermediate period simply a political downturn, a natural result of mismanagement and ecological stress? Or was it something more, a civilizational reckoning with truths too difficult to bear, a forced forgetting of a confrontation with the unknown? Even now, archaeologists continue to uncover tombs, artifacts, and traces from this forgotten century. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, yet the full picture remains elusive. It is as if the land itself refuses to speak clearly of what happened. Egypt would rise again. Temples would be rebuilt. Pharaohs would once more claim divinity. But that dark century remained like a scar beneath the gold. A reminder that even the most eternal empires can fracture. And that when gods fall silent, the world follows. Now we turn not forward, but into another descent. For Egypt's story would fracture once more. Foreign rulers would take power. Strange names would enter the king lists. And the divine order would be tested again, this time by outsiders. Join us next as we uncover the second intermediate period of Egypt, a time when the throne of the pharaoh was not held by Egyptians at all. Second intermediate period, Egypt, when foreign kings ruled the Nile. For much of its history, Egypt stood apart. It was a land that saw itself as the center of order in a world filled with chaos. The pharaoh was not just a ruler but a cosmic force, holding together the balance between gods and men. The Nile flowed with divine regularity. Temples rose in alignment with stars. And while foreign merchants passed through its borders, the throne was always Egyptian. Until suddenly it wasn't. Around 1650 BC, Egypt entered one of the most unsettling chapters in its long history. This was not a time of total collapse like the one that had come centuries earlier. The great cities still stood. The Nile still ran. But something deeper had shifted. The royal line had fractured, the kingdom had splintered, and for the first time, foreigners ruled the crown of Egypt. This was the second intermediate period, a time when the throne was held by outsiders, when the sacred bloodline of the pharaohs was broken, and when the land of the gods no longer belonged entirely to itself. The story begins with the decline of the Middle Kingdom. After the achievements of rulers like Senusret III and Amenemhat III, who expanded Egypt's borders and brought wealth and structure to the land, something began to falter. The central government weakened. Local rulers grew stronger. There were signs of unrest. And in the eastern delta, a new group began to rise, a group the Egyptians would later call the Hyksos. The Hyksos were not a single tribe, but a mixture of Semitic peoples from the Levant, likely from areas that today include parts of Syria and Palestine. They had settled gradually in the northeastern Nile Delta, blending into Egyptian society over generations. At first, they were traders, soldiers, and administrators. But as Egypt's central authority continued to decay, they took more. Eventually, they claimed the throne. By around 1630 BC, the Hyksos established their own dynasty in the city of Avaris in the Delta. They ruled as kings, pharaohs, in title if not in lineage. They adopted elements of Egyptian culture, religion, and ceremony, but they did not hide their origins. Their names, their language, and their customs marked them as foreign. And for Egyptians farther south, particularly those still holding power in Thebes, this was a deep offense, a violation of the natural order. The word Hyksos comes from an Egyptian term that roughly means rulers of foreign lands. Later pharaohs would treat the name with disdain. But during the second intermediate period, they were a force to be reckoned with. They controlled a large portion of northern Egypt, maintained armies, and even engaged in diplomacy with neighboring kingdoms. It's easy to think of this period as one of pure darkness or occupation, but the reality is more complex. The Hyksos brought new technologies to Egypt, including improved bronze weapons, the horse-drawn chariot, and possibly advancements in fortification. These innovations would later be used by Egyptian rulers themselves, turning foreign tools into instruments of power. But at the time, their rule was seen by native Egyptians as deeply unnatural. What made this period so unsettling wasn't just that Egypt had foreign kings. It was that the entire identity of Egypt seemed blurred. The divine connection between the pharaoh and the gods, a link forged since the time of Narmer, had been severed. Rituals that once reinforced Ma'at, the sacred balance, were either altered or abandoned. Temples fell into disuse. Local deities rose in prominence as national unity dissolved. The land still functioned, but the soul of Egypt was fractured. Meanwhile, in Thebes, native Egyptian rulers refused to accept the Hyksos as legitimate. These southern kings, from the 17th dynasty, ruled a diminished territory but held fiercely to the idea of true pharaonic lineage. At first, there was uneasy coexistence. Trade and communication occurred. Borders shifted. But eventually, resistance grew. One of the first to act was a ruler named Second in Ratau. According to tradition, he died violently. His mummy shows massive skull injuries, possibly from battle. His successors, including his sons Kamos and eventually Amos I, carried the fight forward. This was not just a war of territory. It was a war for Egypt's soul. The campaigns were brutal and prolonged. The Hyksos were well fortified in Avaris, protected by strong walls and experienced soldiers. But the Thebans had gained strength, learned to use the Hyksos' own chariots, and rallied the southern provinces. Around 1550 BC, Amos I finally broke through. He captured Avaris, drove the Hyksos out, and pursued them into the Levant. Egypt was once again under native rule. The second intermediate period had ended. But what was restored was not what had been lost. The Egypt that emerged was more militarized, more centralized, and more aggressive. The trauma of foreign rule had left its mark. Amos and his successors founded the 18th dynasty and launched a new kingdom, an era of conquest and empire. Egypt would now seek to control its borders and beyond, to never again be vulnerable to outsiders. And yet, the memory of the Hyksos remained, not just in hatred but in the things they left behind. The chariots, the weapons, the fortified cities, even some religious concepts. Egypt had been invaded, but it had also absorbed. And from that uncomfortable mixture, a new form of power had grown. There is something haunting about this period, not because of dramatic ruins or epic battles, but because of what it says about identity. Egypt had always seen itself as eternal, unchanging, divinely chosen. But in the second intermediate period, that illusion cracked. Outsiders ruled. Traditions shifted. And for a time, Egypt was forced to see itself through a foreign lens. The later kings did their best to erase the memory. They labeled the Hyksos as invaders, monsters, enemies of the gods. They did not include them in official king lists. They spoke of their victory as a cleansing, a restoration of order. But beneath the surface, the influence remained. Even today, archaeological sites like Avaris reveal a layered story. Palaces with both Egyptian and Levantine design. Tombs containing artifacts from distant lands. Skeletons of men and horses buried in a way never seen before in Egypt. The evidence tells us this was not a simple occupation. It was a complex moment of transformation, one that forced Egypt to redefine itself. So was the second intermediate period a fall, or a pivot? A loss of control, or the forging of something new? Perhaps both. Perhaps the strength of later Egypt came not in spite of this foreign rule, but because of how it responded to it. Egypt had weathered invasion and emerged transformed. It had reclaimed its throne and rebuilt its temples, but the scars of foreign rule lingered beneath the gold. Yet as Egypt rose into its new kingdom, other parts of the ancient world were not so fortunate. Far to the northwest, across the Aegean Sea, a different kind of silence was spreading. In the hills of Greece, once home to bronze and palaces, civilization vanished into myth. Writing stopped. Cities crumbled. Memory blurred. Join us next as we explore the Greek Dark Ages, a forgotten dawn hidden between the ruins of heroes and the birth of history. Greek Dark Ages, a forgotten dawn between myth and memory. Before the silence, there were palaces. Stone citadels rose from the hills of Greece, guarded by lions carved in stone. Kings ruled from Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. Their scribes wrote in linear B, tracking grain, cattle, and taxes. Bronze weapons gleamed beneath the sun. Ships crossed the Aegean, carrying goods and stories to and from Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. This was the world of the Mycenaeans, a civilization rich in power, trade, and memory. But then, around 1200 BC, it ended. The Mycenaean world collapsed during the same cataclysm that brought down empires across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned. Writing vanished. Palaces were abandoned. And what followed in Greece was not recovery, not rebuilding, but a long, unsettling quiet. For nearly 400 years, the Greeks left behind almost nothing. No written records. Few grand structures. A silence that would come to be known as the Greek Dark Ages. From roughly 1100 to 800 BC, the land that had once hosted kings and scribes gave way to small, scattered villages. The linear B script disappeared completely, and with it, the ability to read and record. Pottery grew simpler. Burials became more austere. Long-distance trade nearly ceased. In some areas, populations dropped dramatically. The grand stories of heroes and gods faded from documentation into oral tradition. This was not just a loss of complexity, it was a loss of memory. No one knows for certain what caused the extended silence. The collapse of the Bronze Age world surely played a part. With the fall of the Mycenaeans, a system of palatial control and redistribution disintegrated. Without it, the economy faltered. Communication with other cultures broke down. But the deeper mystery lies not in the collapse itself, but in what came after. Because unlike other regions that slowly rebuilt or replaced their systems, Greece seemed to linger in a state of forgetting. For centuries, there was no writing, no monumental construction, no known kings or rulers with clear names or faces. The land continued to be inhabited, but by people who lived small, quiet lives, leaving behind little more than traces of huts, pottery shards, and simple graves. And yet something was preserved, not in stone or ink, but in the minds of storytellers. During this dark and undocumented period, the oral tradition flourished. Elders spoke of past glories. Bards traveled from village to village, reciting tales of great warriors, vengeful gods, and long-lost kingdoms. These stories would later become the foundation of Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but during the Dark Ages, they lived only in memory. This raises a haunting question. How much of what we know about ancient Greece is history, and how much is reconstructed legend? Were Achilles and Odysseus based on real figures from a lost era? Were the Trojan Wars remembered events or imagined echoes? Without writing to anchor them, myth and reality drift together. The Dark Ages blurred the line between truth and tale. The archaeological record during this period is frustratingly thin. Settlements shrank in size and complexity. Most were no more than clusters of huts. Even the graves changed. In the Mycenaean period, tombs were large and elaborate, often cut into rock or built as monumental tholos structures. In the Dark Ages, burials became simpler, more personal, sometimes just a pit in the ground. And then, somewhere around 900 BC, a change began. Slowly, pottery styles grew more intricate again. Trade networks resumed. Foreign goods reappeared in graves. Settlements expanded. And most importantly, a new form of writing emerged, not linear B, but an entirely different script. The Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician system, began to appear around 800 BC. It marked the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of what we now call the Archaic period. But the gap had already taken its toll. Centuries of memory had been lost. Whatever had existed between the fall of Mycenae and the rise of classical Greece had faded. Even the Greeks themselves seemed unsure of what came before. They spoke of an age of heroes, of gods who walked among men, of cities swallowed by time. But they wrote these stories down only centuries later, through the lens of a people rediscovering their voice. What makes the Greek Dark Ages so haunting is not just what disappeared, but what replaced it. When the Greeks returned to writing, to building, to thinking deeply about the world around them, they did so with a sense of rupture. Their myths are filled with exile, return, vengeance, and rebirth. Their gods are capricious, distant, often cruel. Their heroes are tragic, walking a line between glory and doom. It is as if the long silence had reshaped their understanding of the human experience. Even today, archaeologists continue to search for clues in this forgotten era. They dig beneath later cities, looking for signs of continuity or disruption. They analyze burial patterns, metallurgy, and climate data. Some have found signs of gradual resilience, a slow rebuilding rather than a sudden rebirth. Others believe that something more traumatic occurred, something that severed Greece from its own past so completely that only fragments remained. Could it have been more than just collapse? Could knowledge have been actively suppressed, temples desecrated, written records burned? Or did the Greeks simply let go of what had come before, worn down by war, famine, or internal revolt? The truth may be a mixture of both. What is clear is that a civilization once capable of communicating across the seas and building massive citadels became, for centuries, a culture of smallness, of silence, and of stories whispered beside the fire. The Greek Dark Ages stand as a reminder that not all collapses are visible. Sometimes, they leave no smoking ruins, no final battle, no grand fall. Sometimes, they are a slow fading of memory, a long night that swallows history not with fire, but with forgetting. And perhaps that is the most dangerous kind of disappearance. One that leaves no scars. Only questions. Now we leave the shores of Greece and sail westward, across an ocean and through centuries, to another land where memory fades and silence reigns. In the dense jungles of Central America, a great civilization rose with towering temples and complex calendars. And then, just as suddenly, its heartlands were abandoned. Cities fell quiet. Glyphs ceased. Join us next as we uncover the mystery of the Maya collapse, and the strange silence that engulfed one of the most brilliant cultures of the ancient world. The Maya collapse, cities abandoned, gods silent. In the heart of Central America, deep within jungles that now grow wild and tangled, stand the remains of a civilization once defined by its precision, power, and profound connection to time. The Maya were astronomers, architects, artists, and mathematicians. They tracked the movement of planets with uncanny accuracy. They carved stone temples that scraped the sky. They wrote histories in glyphs and rituals in blood. But somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, something changed. Something so vast and so final that it emptied their greatest cities, silenced their scribes, and left behind a legacy of questions carved into stone. This was not the end of the Maya as a people. Their descendants still live throughout southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. But what collapsed was their world, specifically, the great urban centers of the southern lowlands. Cities like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and Calakmul, once thriving with tens of thousands of people, were suddenly abandoned. Roads became roots. Plazas filled with leaves. Temples stood in silence. The Maya collapse, as it's often called, was not a single moment but a slow unraveling. Between roughly 800 and 900 CE, the monumental building projects stopped. The elaborate carving of hieroglyphs ceased. Political alliances broke apart. Dynasties disappeared. By 1000 CE, many of the most powerful Maya cities had fallen into ruin. What caused such a profound transformation remains one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. Many theories have been proposed, none complete, all intriguing. Some point to ecological stress. The Maya relied on intensive agriculture to support their growing urban populations. Evidence from lake sediments and tree rings suggests a period of severe drought during the 9th century. In a landscape where the timing of rain could mean life or death, such a drought would have been catastrophic. With failed crops came famine. With famine came unrest. And with unrest came the fall of kings. But drought alone cannot explain the scale of the collapse. The Maya had endured previous climate shifts. They had built sophisticated water management systems, reservoirs, canals, and terraces, to mitigate the harshness of the dry season. Their priests and astronomers could predict celestial events with precision. Why, then, did they fail to respond this time? Was the drought worse than we know? Or did something else erode the structures that held Maya society together? Others suggest political fragmentation. The Maya world was never a single empire but a patchwork of city-states, constantly vying for dominance through war, alliances, and marriage. In the centuries before the collapse, inscriptions show a rise in conflict, more warfare, more conquests, more political instability. As rival cities tore each other down, the overall system may have become too fragile to withstand external shocks. Kings lost legitimacy. People lost faith. The gods grew quiet. There is also evidence of social upheaval. In some cities, monuments were deliberately defaced. Royal tombs were broken into. The names of rulers were erased. This suggests rebellion, not just collapse from above, but pressure from below. Perhaps the burdens of elite demands, endless rituals, and extravagant construction projects became too much for the people to bear. Perhaps, when the rains failed and the wars dragged on, they simply walked away. The Maya collapse is often framed as a disappearance, but in truth, it was a shift, a turning inward, a return to smaller settlements, a reorganization of life away from royal courts and towering pyramids. The northern cities, like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, would continue to flourish for some time. The Maya adapted. But the brilliance of the classic period, the age of Tikal and Copan, of stele and sacred calendars, was gone. And still, the glyphs leave clues. On stele and stairways, the last recorded kings stand stiffly, their names cut short, their lines ending abruptly. The scribes, who once chronicled births, battles, and offerings to the gods, fall silent. Entire dynasties vanish from the record. Not with a bang, but with an absence. As if something, some knowledge, some truth, was lost not just to history, but to memory itself. Archaeologists continue to dig, to map, to scan the jungles for hidden temples and forgotten roads. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle. But the heart of the mystery remains. Why did the Maya stop building? Why did they stop writing? Why did they abandon cities that had stood for centuries? Some believe it was a perfect storm: drought, war, rebellion, and environmental degradation all feeding into each other until the system could no longer sustain itself. Others wonder if something more enigmatic played a role. A breakdown in cosmic order. A failure of prophecy. A loss of trust in the priests and astronomers who had once promised to keep the world aligned with the heavens. In a civilization so intertwined with time, what happens when the calendar loses its meaning? There are theories that touch the edge of the speculative. That the collapse coincided with celestial events, eclipses, alignments, that were seen not as phenomena, but as omens. That the priests interpreted these signs as the end of an age, and the people obeyed. That the cities were left not in chaos, but in ritual closure. It's difficult to know, and the jungle keeps its secrets well. What's certain is this: the Maya did not vanish. Their languages are still spoken. Their traditions endure. But the classic Maya world, the cities, the courts, the voices carved in stone, ended. And no one, not even the Maya themselves, wrote down why. We are left with towering pyramids swallowed by trees, ball courts buried beneath moss, glyphs half erased by wind and rain, and a silence that speaks louder than any inscription. A silence that stretches across centuries. Now we leave the forests of Mesoamerica and return to the cradle of South Asia, where another great civilization once flourished beside a river that no longer flows as it did. In the Indus Valley, vast cities rose with planning far ahead of their time. But like the Maya, they too disappeared, and their script remains unread. Join us next as we explore the mystery of the Indus Valley collapse, and what happens when a civilization leaves behind everything except its silence. The fall of the Indus Valley civilization, a silence written in brick. Long before the rise of Greece, before the pyramids of Egypt reached their peak, and while Mesopotamia still wrote its earliest laws in clay, a civilization blossomed in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwest India. It stretched across more than 1 million square kilometers, larger than either Egypt or Mesopotamia. It built cities with precise grids, underground drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and massive public works, all without kings, without palaces, and without known temples. This was the Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called Harappan after one of its major cities. It flourished for over 700 years, from around 2600 BC, peaking in urban sophistication around 2000 BC. And then it vanished. Not in war. Not in flame. But in gradual, ghostly retreat. Between 1900 and 1300 BC, the great cities emptied. The writing stopped. The bricks crumbled. And the voice of one of the world's earliest urban cultures faded into silence. The Indus Valley civilization is one of the most puzzling mysteries in ancient history. At its height, it produced cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, designed with a regularity and forethought that rival modern planning. Streets intersected at right angles. Homes had private wells and even early toilets. Public granaries and assembly halls suggested complex administration. Yet nowhere do we find a palace. Nowhere a statue of a ruling king. No massive temples for gods. No war monuments. And most of all, no deciphered writing. Thousands of inscriptions have been found on seals, pottery, and tablets, short lines of symbols that appear structured, deliberate, perhaps even poetic. But no one today can read them. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, the Indus script has no bilingual Rosetta Stone. No known language descends clearly from it. And until it is deciphered, the thoughts, names, prayers, and histories of an entire civilization remain locked away in silence. What we do know comes from bricks and bones, from drains and wells. The cities were remarkably uniform. Across hundreds of kilometers, buildings followed the same standards. The same brick sizes, the same urban patterns. This suggests some kind of central coordination, but without kings, what kind? It's as if the Indus people governed not by fear or divine command, but through consensus, trade, and code. Their economy was vibrant. They traded with Mesopotamia, where their goods were called Maluha. They exported carnelian beads, cotton cloth, ivory, and precious stones. They imported silver, tin, and cultural ideas. Seals with Indus script have been found in the ruins of ancient Sumer. They were not isolated. They were connected. And then they withdrew. Around 1900 BC, the signs of change begin to appear. The writing dwindles. Urban planning loses precision. Buildings become smaller, sloppier. Trade networks fragment. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, once a monumental centerpiece of public life, is no longer maintained. Kills cool. Crafts fade. The people do not vanish, but the civilization unravels. What happened? One theory speaks of the rivers. The Indus and its tributaries, especially the now dry Gagar-Hakra, may have shifted course due to tectonic changes. Some cities were left dry, others flooded. Agriculture would have suffered. Populations would have moved. Another theory points to climate. A gradual drying trend may have made the region less hospitable. Droughts could have reduced crop yields, weakened the economy, and increased internal stress. Some suggest political breakdown. Though we see no evidence of monarchy or empire, the loss of urban cohesion hints at systems no longer functioning. Others wonder about invasion. Indo-Aryan migrations from Central Asia occurred during this period. But the archaeological record shows no widespread violence, no scorched cities, no mass graves. If invasion happened, it was slow, absorbed, and likely occurred after the collapse had already begun. What's striking is the quietness of it all. The cities weren't destroyed, they were abandoned. Slowly, deliberately, and in stages. It's as if the people turned away from the cities they had built, one by one, until all that remained was brick and dust. The culture didn't die, it diffused. As the great cities fell, rural life expanded. New villages emerged. Pottery styles changed. Technologies shifted. Some cultural threads endured, weaving into later South Asian traditions. But the clarity of the Indus voice, the brilliance of its urban moment, was lost. And the writing never returned. In a world where civilizations are often remembered through conquest, through kings and wars and gods carved into stone, the Indus story is different. It is a story written in uniform bricks, in drains and wells, in standardized measures, and short, silent symbols no one can read. It is the echo of a people who mastered water before weapons, who built cities without empires, and who disappeared without leaving a single boastful chronicle behind. Even today, archaeologists are still discovering new sites. Hundreds, perhaps thousands remain buried beneath fields and sands. But every dig raises as many questions as it answers. Who led these people? How did they organize? What gods did they worship, if any? What wisdom lies in the unread script that covers their seals and amulets? Some suggest that their collapse is not a tragedy, but a transformation. That they chose decentralization, a return to smaller, more sustainable forms of life in the face of environmental stress. That theirs is not a tale of failure, but adaptation. Others believe we are simply missing the key, the code to unlock their memory. And until we find it, the Indus Valley remains not just a civilization, but a question. A question written in silence. Now we travel far across sea and centuries, to the eastern edge of another island world. In the shadow of volcanoes and beneath the gaze of rising emperors, Japan too passed through a twilight age, a time when history left behind few names, few chronicles, and a curious emptiness in its national story. Join us next as we enter the forgotten past of ancient Japan, a historical gap still wrapped in myth and mist. The lost history of ancient Japan, between gods and emperors. There is a silence at the center of Japan's past. A centuries-long blur where myth gives way to memory, but history has yet to take hold. Between the 3rd and 6th century CE, Japan moved from scattered chiefdoms and earthen mounds to imperial court and recorded law. It was a time of profound transformation, of technology, writing, religion, and identity. And yet, for all its importance, so much of what happened remains hidden in shadows. This is not just a gap in records. It is a gap in understanding. A gap between what was, and what we say was. A gap that still shapes Japan's sense of itself. Known to scholars as the Kofun period, named after the massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds built during this time, this era runs roughly from 300 to 538 CE. But to call it a defined period is misleading. It was an age of emergence, where fragments of statehood began to form but did not yet cohere. An age when the Yamato clan rose, not through iron and conquest alone, but through ritual, marriage, and myth. And most crucially, it was a time before Japan had writing of its own. This means that almost everything we know, or think we know, about the early history of Japan comes not from Japanese voices, but from the outside. From Chinese dynastic chronicles. From Korean inscriptions. From archaeology. The earliest mention of Japan appears in a Chinese record from 297 CE, describing a land of many small kingdoms, one of which was ruled by a woman named Himiko. She was a shaman queen, mysterious and revered, who maintained peace through magic, ritual, and diplomacy with the Wei court. She lived in a palace guarded by 1,000 attendants. She spoke only through intermediaries. And after her death, chaos erupted. The story of Queen Himiko is as fascinating as it is elusive. Chinese sources mention her. Japanese tradition does not. Her name appears nowhere in native chronicles. No tomb has been definitively linked to her. And yet, her presence haunts this early period, an echo of a forgotten matriarchy, erased or obscured in the rise of patriarchal rule. By the 4th century, one clan began to dominate, the Yamato, centered in the Naro Basin. Their power was not absolute, but they began to assert control over surrounding regions, forming alliances and engaging in battle. Large Kofun mounds, some over 400 meters long, were constructed as tombs for rulers. These earthworks required enormous labor and organization. Inside, stone chambers held grave goods, mirrors, weapons, ornaments, signs of wealth and connection to the continent. But the Yamato rulers left no written legacy. No laws, no poems, no declarations. It wasn't until the 8th century, centuries after the fact, that the first written records of Japan's early history appeared, compiled by court scholars who drew from oral traditions, clan myths, and political agendas. The Kojiki, 712, and Nihon Shoki, 720, are Japan's earliest chronicles, blending the divine with the human in a seamless myth history that begins with the creation of the islands by gods and flows into the divine descent of the emperors. These texts tell us that the imperial family traces its lineage back to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. That the first emperor, Jimmu, took the throne in 660 BC, establishing a divine right that continues in modern times. But these stories were written long after the events they describe. And their purpose was not historical accuracy, but legitimacy. They do not mention Himiko. They downplay foreign influence. They elevate Yamato as the sacred center, even as archaeology tells a more tangled tale. For while the Yamato grew in strength, they did so through interaction, not isolation. Evidence shows steady contact with the Korean peninsula, and through it, with China. Metallurgy, agriculture, burial customs, and even early writing came via Korea. Inscriptions on imported mirrors and weapons suggest literacy existed among elites, but only in borrowed languages. Buddhism, too, would soon arrive across this corridor, carried not by warriors, but by monks, texts, and icons. And yet, despite these deep connections, the Japanese chroniclers of the 8th century would write as if Yamato rule emerged fully formed, divinely guided, untouched by foreign hand. The gap between the archaeological record and the written tradition grows wide here. Tombs without names, artifacts without stories, centuries without native records. And a nation that would later define itself through continuity, emperor to emperor, son to son, built upon a silence. Why is this period so mysterious? Partly because it was not yet history in the way we define it, no state archives, no widespread writing. But also because later generations looked back and reshaped it. The Kofun period was retroactively polished into a golden age, where divine right merged with political control. Dissenting voices, rival clans, and powerful women were smoothed over. Himiko disappeared. Alternative centers of power were absorbed into myth. The fog that covers this era is not just from time, but from narrative. Even the great tombs remain silent. The largest Kofun, the Daizenryo in Osaka, traditionally believed to be the resting place of Emperor Nintoku, is over 35 acres wide. But it has never been excavated. The Imperial Household Agency forbids it. To dig would be to question the sacred lineage. To disturb the silence would risk rewriting the foundation. And so the silence remains. A gap not of ignorance, but of choice. A space in which history was not just forgotten, but reimagined. Today, scholars, archaeologists, and independent researchers continue to piece together this lost age. They study pottery patterns, metallurgy, burial goods. They re-examine foreign sources. Some suggest that Japan's early statehood was shaped far more by Korea than once admitted. Others argue for the survival of matriarchal power longer than the records allow. But all agree, this period holds the key to understanding how Japan became Japan. It is a time between the gods and the emperors. Between Himiko's whispered rituals and the codified rule of the Yamato court. Between oral tradition and written law. A threshold where memory and myth intertwine. And now we cross a different kind of threshold. From the islands of the east to the forests and highlands of Western Europe. Long before Rome ever rose, there was another world. A world of warriors, druids, and stone circles. But in the centuries before conquest, much of this world faded from record. Join us next as we uncover the mystery of the Celtic prehistoric gap, a silence that still echoes through the mists of ancient Europe. The Celtic prehistoric gap whispers before the written word. Before the legions of Rome crossed the Alps, before Caesar etched his campaigns into history, there was another Europe, older, wilder, unrecorded. In the forests of Gaul, the hills of Britain, and the misty bogs of Ireland, a civilization thrived in silence. It built no empires in stone. It left behind no libraries, no scrolls, no chronicles of its own. And yet, it shaped everything that came after. This was the world of the ancient Celts. A world of iron and song, of warrior queens and sacred groves, of rituals performed beneath stars and stories passed from voice to voice. It existed for centuries before the first Latin scribe ever tried to describe it, and when he did, much of what he wrote was already fading. From roughly 800 to 100 BCE, across much of Western and Central Europe, Celtic culture flourished in what archaeologists now call the Latine period. Named after a lakeside site in modern Switzerland where ornate metalwork was found, this age produced weapons, jewelry, tools, and art of stunning craftsmanship. But its people wrote nothing down. Not because they could not, but because they chose not to. According to later Roman sources, the Druids, the priestly class of Celtic society, forbade writing sacred knowledge. Wisdom was to be memorized, lived, and transmitted only through the human voice. In a world where knowledge was power, the spoken word held more authority than ink ever could. And so for generations, History was sung, recited, and remembered. Until it wasn't. By the time the Romans encountered the Celts in force, the silence had already begun to deepen. Conquest brought with it roads, cities, taxes, and scrolls, and the slow unraveling of a tradition rooted in breath and rhythm. The Druids were suppressed. The stories forgotten. And the centuries before Caesar became a haze, known only through shards, burial mounds, and the second-hand writings of their conquerors. What remains of this prehistoric world is hauntingly incomplete. We find torques of twisted gold in the earth, swords buried beside chieftains, and chariots rusting in peat. We find hill forts whose defenses tell of long-forgotten battles. We find art that swirls with motion, spirals, beasts, and symbols that speak in a language lost to time. But we do not find names. We do not find dates. We do not find the Celts telling their own story. And so we are left to wonder. Who were these people who carved gods into trees but left no scriptures? Who ruled these lands before Rome arrived? What were their laws, their prayers, their philosophies? Were the tales of Cuchulainn and Boudica echoes of real memory, or later inventions stitched together in the absence of truth? We know they had trade. Greek and Etruscan goods reached their hands. We know they had social stratification, warriors, farmers, artisans, and priests. We know they worshipped in sacred spaces, rivers, groves, stones. But so much of what they believed, feared, and loved has vanished beneath centuries of silence and assimilation. Even today, the ancient Celtic world remains fragmented. Some of its stories survive in medieval Irish and Welsh texts, written down centuries later by Christian monks. But these texts are part preservation, part transformation. The gods become heroes. The rituals become allegory. The oral becomes written, and in the process changed. Archaeologists work with what they can. They read patterns in burial goods, in weapon caches, in art styles. They map out migrations and trade routes. But the heart of this civilization, the voices of its people, remains quiet. The Celtic world was erased not by fire, but by forgetting. It was overwritten, gradually, by empire, by language, and by time. And yet, it never fully disappeared. Its echoes linger in place names, in folktales, in the rhythm of ancient languages still whispered in corners of Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and Wales. Its symbols reappear in stone carvings, in tattoos, in the dreams of those searching for roots deeper than the Roman road. The Celtic prehistoric gap is not just a hole in history. It is a space where memory once lived, a space where stories were passed in darkness and firelight, and where those stories now float, untethered, waiting to be heard again. And so, we close the first book in our journey through the lost centuries. From the broken empires of Europe to the jungle-covered ruins of the Maya, from the floodplains of the Indus to the silent stones of the Celts, we have wandered through the blank spaces history left behind. We have not always found answers. But we have found questions, honest, haunting questions, carved into the bones of time. This was only the beginning. Because the silence of history is never truly empty. It waits. Beneath the earth. Behind the myth. Between the lines. And the more we listen, the more we realize how much we've forgotten, and how much remains to be rediscovered. Join us next time, as we open a new chapter. A new mystery. Another echo from the ancient world. Because history isn't just what's written. It's also what's missing.